Let's talk shifter. Let's talk about dimension shifter and its application in everyone's favorite deck, the Spright deck, the pure Spright deck that is. So I made a couple of videos on this particular card here, on whether or not we should be running in the main deck. Actually, I made one before the actual format occurred, before it actually sprung into action, and I made the declaration that shifter was going to be a mainstay in the deck. And that was only for the pure Spright variant, and I'm here to say that I'm going to stick by it. So what I'm going to talk about today is whether or not we are going to keep shifter in, and why we're keeping it in, why it's such a good card, and maybe whether we should be using it going first or going second, or when we should be using it actually. So first of all, let's look at the other decks that are currently in the meta. So I'm going to read down the list once again, and I'm going to talk about let's go through the ones that we will be using against first, right? So let's say Fire King and Snake Eye, of course. And then there's the pure Snake Eye build, of course, yet again, first and second. Medium Scareclaw, I think that is probably a good one to run if they're going first. Then there's Voiceless Voice. I think going first or second is quite solid, so keep it in. And then the Runic variants, you have Runic for Hire Spright, which you don't really see nowadays. Then there's also Runic Live Twin Spright, which you also don't see much nowadays, and also the Joshua Schmidt list. I haven't versed one of those in like a very long time, but against all of those decks, once again, shifter is solid. Then there's those like Horus packages, like Tier Horus and like Horus, like what's that? Light Darkness Dragon Turbo. There's also Pearly. Pearly's quite vulnerable to a shifter if they're going first, if they play a quick play in the draw phase. Centurion, again, is also quite weak to shifter, so good to run. Branded Despia and Branded Chimera are both quite weak to shifter as well. And then you have the other decks that I haven't talked about just yet, so that those being Labyrinth, Pure Spright, the Flu deck, Cash deck, and Vanquish Soul deck. I think against all of those, depending on which ones you're looking at, so for example, Labyrinth and Spright, it can do a little bit, Vanquish Soul as well, but it's not quite impactful enough to the point where you want to run it because it's going to hurt you more than it's going to hurt your opponent. And that's really the question you want to be asking yourself all the time, right? Like, is the shifter going to hurt your opponent more, or is it going to hurt my plays more? Am I going to be able to break the board here, depending on what I open? And so that would determine whether or not you want to actually throw it out. Now, throwing it blind or with the knowledge on what your opponent's playing, that's a whole different story. If you're in a locals where you're constantly competing against like the same few people and you know the deck's ins and outs, everything about like how they play, whatever, as long as you know the deck, you should be able to just blind shift to them going first or second, regardless of what they're playing, because presumably you should know the decks already. So if they're playing any of the decks that are listed prior, throw it out, right? But at the very end, those last couple, including especially Cash and Flu, obviously if you throw it, you're just going -1. And that answers the question of whether you should be using it blind first when you are opening shifter in your hand. I think the answer is a very clear no, because just in case you end up not being able to, let's say make a sustainable board, shifter is going to stop you from going to your sprint plays, which kind of just cocks you even more, especially if they're playing a shifter deck themselves, in which case they don't really care. And then for some of the other decks I mentioned prior up on top of the list, for example, Pearly and even Labyrinth, right? If you're going first, they don't really care. They'll be able to like either break your board or OTK you, and so it is quite the issue if you blind shifter going first and hope for the best. Instead, keeping your hand, I think, is a better play. My deck in particular does have a discard engine, which is Super Polymerization, which of course works on the shifter as well. But if you open up a shifter that you want to discard, that can be a discard fodder. Worst case scenario, kind of like how Pearly can also play shifter going second, because it won't hurt them, right? They'll be able to use the brown cat to attack over with happiness as well. All right, so if you're going second, when should you be using it? Well, ideally, you want to be using it during the draw phase to avoid getting triple tactics talanced. That's a weird one to say, talanced. But regardless, that means not using it during the main phase, but at the same time, you typically won't be able to figure out whether or not they are playing a deck that is vulnerable to shifter until they enter their main phase. Unless that is they're playing some quick play spells, for example, Wanted, and any of the Pearly spells. Emblem Oath, I think. Is that the Centurion card? Something like that, like Emblem. I think I have like 2 different cards. Maybe I am, right? There's a quick play spell. But typically they might actually throw something out, maybe like a branded opening in the draw phase to play around draw a little bit. If any of those cards come out, then you can safely Shifter during the draw phase. Otherwise, I would probably be doing the same thing, just waiting until main phase 1 to confirm that they are indeed playing a Shifter vulnerable deck, especially in the game 1 scenario, right? Only in the game 1 scenario, because at game 2, assuming you know what your opponent's playing, assuming they didn't just see your board and scoop, you should have some kind of intel on what they're playing, and then you can make the call. So for those who are asking whether or not to play Shifter going first or second, you make your own judgment based on what I've just told you. Now you can tell this is take 2 because I activated the effect of Fenrir, but I'm still getting there with my recordings. So let's say hypothetically you had an opening hand that looks something like this, and I'm sure this has happened multiple times to any of you guys. And maybe let's say you opened up, because this happens quite often, an Angler as well. So if we have these cards in hand, we can go for the sprint line by specialing the Fenrir, normal summoning the Nimble Angler, linking into sprint, blah, 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 blah. You guys know the combo, right? But that is very risky because it plays directly into Nib and a single hand trap, like any hand trap. So essentially it plays into pretty much anything, right? Aside from like draw. So to avoid that, I think the best play, if you have Shifter as well, is to just pretend to be a Cashier deck instead. So what we're going to do is during the main phase, we're going to special out the Fenrir, we're going to declare the effect, and we're going to try and bait out a hand trap. So assuming that they don't know what you're playing, they might Veiler it, they might Imperm it, they might Ash it. In fact, if it resolves, right, if you get the Fenrir search out, you might even get drawed here. And the idea is just to eat any hand trap as many as possible with your singular play, even though you don't actually have anything, just to deck thin a little bit, because going for the sprint line is not worth it. Dropping the Shifter early is just going to deny them of the Veiler or the draw, which you do care about. And so I think it makes more sense to just do your Fenrir search first, try and bait out any other interruption, and then we'll go to the end phase, and during the end phase we're going to activate Shifter and drop it in the graveyard. And so this might look a little weak, and by all means it is pretty weak, right, admittedly so, but keep in mind that you have 2 other cards in your hand right now that are hopefully not too bricky. Maybe open like a super polymerization as well, which would be quite nice with the Angler. And obviously if there was a super poly, you would have set that already during the main phase. And maybe you can super poly on your turn, your next turn, discarding the Angler for a nice start with 2 Beavers. The idea is just you have a Fenrir to try and banish one of their monsters, you have an Ash or maybe another hand trap to disrupt them. That still works under Shifter, and they also have to play under Shifter. So this is like a call you can make on your own judgment, on your own terms, depending on whether or not you think that they will lose to a Shifter, or if you have no other place and you think this is the best out. Now we're going to open up a second hand. Okay, now in part 2 of our hypotheticals, we are going to be looking at Shifter with just a Nimble Beaver. Now, why do I have this in my hand instead of the standard Sprite stuff? Well, because sometimes you'll draw just a Beaver and nothing else, or maybe like a random Sprite red or carrot plus any level 2 that doesn't do anything by themselves. So we're going to normal summon Beaver effect, and obviously with just a Beaver you want to go for the gigantic so you can get the rest of the sprites online. So we're going to overlay here and go to gigantic sprite. So a couple of things can happen when you summon the gigantic sprite and declare its effect. You might get ashed here, it might go through, and let's talk about those 2 options, right? If it goes through, hooray, like you go do your normal stuff, you would not chain Shifter here because you want to go through your sprint combo. And again, like I mentioned prior in this video, you can discard the D-Shifter for maybe like a super poly or maybe like a nightmare in your extra deck in the next turn if you need to. So for now, it'll just sit there kind of like as a bluff, as an unknown that your opponent doesn't know of. The other option is you might get hand trapped here. Maybe you get Impermed or Ash, which is unfortunate, but like you weren't going to do anything anyways, which also gives you the option to drop the Shifter now anyways, just to mess with their plays a little bit. Keep in mind that if you started with just 1 Beaver, that means you have 3 other cards in hand. Maybe you can set like super polys, try and like disrupt their plays with your hand traps and make the best out of it before the next turn rolls around to try and survive. Not dropping shifter early does have its detriments as well. Obviously, it means that you might get Valid or maybe on resolution. Let's say we pitch that, we summon blue, and obviously we hate that dreaded on res. Yeah, you search the jet and you go on res draw. Okay, cool. Well, then shifter could have stopped that hypothetically if we knew about it, but we didn't, and we still don't want to cut off our angler line through a sprint. So after this, if we get drawed, we'll just go through the normal stuff, go into like a sprint, which will dump angler for 2 beavers into like a Melfi card or like a mannequin cat, depending on what you're trying to do here, right? But the point is, shifter is sometimes still viable even if you're going first and you have no other plays. It can just be a way to try and force your opponent to stop playing as well. Yeah, that'll be it for this video. If you guys found this useful, please feel free to leave a comment, let me know any feedback. Please give it a like if you did enjoy it. And I can't believe I'm saying that, I shouldn't say that. Till next time, see you guys.